everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Not Reading for Content. In this second season, the first book that we're reading for translations is Cornelia Funke's Inkheart. This is our 2/3 of the way discussion, fully spoilered, so make sure that you have read chapters 19 through 37, and obviously make sure that you have in mind our books for the next couple months. Those will be in the description if you want to get your holds in, maybe buy them ahead of time, anything like that. Before we get into discussing Inkheart, though, we always start an episode with our bookish bite. And so, Danny, I have a question for you. The question is, how do we feel about authors killing off main characters?
Ooh, I like it.
Oh gosh, you crazy person, you sadist.
I know it's probably a little bit of a hot take because I think that there is a kind of a negative viewpoint on that a lot of times because people do get very, very attached to characters, and I do as well. But I think that the reason I like it is because it happens so rarely. I like it when an author takes that step because it makes it feel like the events that this character are going through are truly at some really high stakes. I get very frustrated with the resurrection trope in general. I hate when authors take this almost emotionally manipulative, really traumatic event and make you go through thinking a character dies just to bring them back. Like, if I'm going to go through the trauma, let me go through it. Like, let me see it to its end. I also think that sometimes when the resurrection trope gets brought in, it cheapens the death of whatever that character. It cheapens the thing that that character went through. For me, I also think that authors need to be, or I guess authors are, if they do decide to kill off a main character, required to be really creative and dive into grief and not shy away from those topics and our characters having to deal with it. What I don't want to see is a character die and then we never hear about them again. It's like they never existed. Our characters just kind of forget and move on. I understand that in certain fantasy worlds, for instance, when we're having a lot of wars and things go on, there are some characters that are inevitably going to die, and the characters that are still living might not have a moment to grieve then because they might be fighting for their lives. But I love those little moments that authors will take after the fact to have our characters circle back to the events that have gone on. So I am of the mind that more of our main and primary characters should die because I think that it's more realistic, I guess. What's your opinion?
I would say it might be drastic to say I love when main characters die, so I won't go that far. But I do know what you mean. So if an author is willing to take the story in that direction, and if it makes sense, and ultimately there isn't much more for this main character to do or to grow within the storyline moving forward, especially if it's a series and one of these main characters dies, say in book 3 of 5. Hopefully that means that we've gotten enough of this main character to not feel as though we've missed out on opportunities, because I have experienced this before where I've seen the death of a main character and I accept the author's choice to do it, but I think you did it too soon, or
Yeah.
it felt as though it was forced again to provide its own type of emotional manipulation. I think that the death of a main character, even without the resurrection trope, just in general, killing off a character can be emotionally manipulative, depending on
Yeah, for
what the
sure.
point is. If it doesn't feel like it really truly is part of the plot and makes sense in the world. I have also seen authors kind of anticipate a character's death, which I understand. There can be a certain process to writing a novel or writing a series where you have a character's death very far planned, right? Into the future, you know what's going to happen. But at the same time, depending on why you've included this character in the story, if it's simply to anticipate their death later on, that is something I've seen where, for instance, a friend of ours, Brittany, was reading the Fourth Wing series. I can't remember what the series is called, but you guys know what I'm talking about. And I think it was the third book that recently came out. She was saying, wow, we've been introduced to so many new main characters. And I told her that's probably because a lot of them are going to die. like this author is trying to save some of the main characters while still getting us to that, emotional loss. There's war going on. And so, hey, here's a solution. You get to keep your darlings, but I'm going to have you become invested in new main characters so then they can die instead. So I think that it's kind of a two-edged sword where it can make sense. It can be really, impactful, but depending on how the author does it, it's also a bit of a risk. So I think it has to be well written, just like anything, because yeah, you can have a reader resent you for killing off a character when that actually doesn't make sense to either the subgenre or the plot at hand.
Yeah, and I'll add to that with you talking about Fourth Wing and the fact that you're just noting that a lot of those new characters are going to be sacrificial lambs. I think that they can do it too much. I think it's not impactful if you're gonna go Game of Thrones where everyone dies. Like, it's at that point, like, you're not gonna gain connections with any of the characters because inevitably that character is going to be taken from you. So, I do think that there's a fine line between it being really impactful and well-written, as you've just said, and overdone and still emotionally manipulative. So, yeah, I think that there's pros and cons for both.
Yeah, and what am I even trying to say here? Here's the question. It's complicated because we're also talking main characters, not secondary
Yeah.
characters. And I think that this discussion can make us bleed into the idea of just having death on the page in general. But when we're talking main characters, we mean either our protagonist, the character that is moving the plot forward, even possibly our narrator or the main character that the narrator is following,
Mhm.
or just those first maybe like 5 or 6 characters that come to mind as being super impactful. So those who haven't only been on the page maybe 3 or 4 times, they should be a part of the significant part of the plot where if they're removed, we notice, all of the characters notice. And that also ends up kind of, I think, blurring lines where secondary characters, unfortunately, I think we see them die a lot. It's a lot easier to kill them off. And that can also be emotionally impactful, especially if it's a companion character or someone that's supportive of one of the main characters. That's really great. But it all depends on, if the author is skilled enough to have it done appropriately where we feel satisfied and don't
Yeah.
potentially rage quit the series, because I have heard other people do that before. But on that note, this obviously is a topic that may or may not be touched upon moving forward into this discussion, because we try to make the bookish bite lean into something that may have happened in the section that we read. So keep your ears out in case we do end up discussing that. But first and foremost, we do have to summarize the plot, just get us a little bit of a taste test so we have a direction of where we're going. And Danny, you're going to be doing that for us today.
I do. I have the lucky lucky
So
task
lucky.
of summarizing. I am going to be more brief in my summary because there are a ton of little events that we go through, and we'll get into them in our discussion. But just to give you guys a little synopsis of the things that we have seen in today's pages from chapter 19 through 37. We start off our pages with our characters Meggie, Mo, and Eleanor stuck in a cell in Capricorn's village that he is in. And Dustfinger is a practiced lockpick, and he gets them out. And so they all go on the run. The villains Basta and Flathead. I keep wanting to say Flathead. It's Flatnose. Basta and Flatnose take suit and follow them into the woods, finding them, and they break free once again, wrapping Flatnose and Basta up so they can't follow them, and they seek out the author of Inkheart because they are trying to find another copy of Inkheart since Capricorn currently has the only copy in existence. A lot of other things happen. We have Eleanor finding out that her beloved library has been burned down. We have the author talking about this really tragic thing that happens in his story that we will discuss. And we inevitably end back up in Capricorn's village because Vasta and Flatnose catch up with Meggie and capture her. Dustfinger ends up back there by other means, and that's where we start today's discussion.
Thank you for that summary, Danny. I actually now just simply want to go back to our bookish bite and connect it to why it actually was inspired by what we were reading today. And I think we learn a significant amount about the backstories for the characters who've been pulled out of Inkheart. One of them in particular is Dustfinger. And while he's very untrustworthy, kind of a bit of a sinister character, gray character at times, where he has actually manipulated our main characters, Meggie, Mo, taken advantage of them, and obviously put his own needs before theirs, or at least his own desires before theirs. He's a complex character, and we also end up learning this quite heartbreaking reality that he might be returning to if he even gets back to Inkheart. So to backtrack, one of the characters that's introduced in this section is the author himself, Fenolio, and what his purposes were for writing the story, what he thinks about his own characters, and why he wrote their ends the way that he did. And one of the character's ends that we learn about is Dustfinger, and that he will inevitably die. He will be murdered, killed, trying to defend his pet, probably one of the only beings he actually does love, whether it be in the fictional world that he comes from or in the real world that he's been pulled into. And he doesn't necessarily plan to sacrifice his life, but their intention is to kill Gwyn, his Martin character, his Martin pet. And when he's trying to protect the Martin, one of Capricorn's men, we don't know who it is, does end up killing him. And this is fascinating to consider from Maggie's perspective as an avid reader, as a lover of stories. And she doesn't really like Dustfinger for most of this book. She doesn't trust him. And obviously, he has hurt her. However, as soon as she discovers that he's going to die, she immediately thinks, we need to tell him this so that he knows not to return to his story. She wants to protect him and prevent his death. And I find that to be quite fascinating, because if she were reading the story, would she care about his death, knowing that it's fictional? Whereas at the moment, it's almost as if this has become a bit of a nonfiction book, because now he is flesh and blood. She's met him. She knows that he's a real person, at least as far as our understanding of this narrative goes. And it's hard for her to cope with the idea of him being killed so violently. And I think that that's really fascinating for us to kind of consider as readers reading this book and potentially knowing that characters are going to die. How connected are we? Would we be disappointed if any of these characters died? What did you think, Danny?
Yeah, I was distraught by the means in which he died, because of the fact that he was doing something like that's actually redeeming. I think it's interesting that we had this moment in today's pages when the last episode you were talking about how Gwen softens Dustfinger's character, and the fact that he actually lends to giving that character a little bit of warmth. And then we now have this scenario where that amount of, I guess, connection to another being leads to Dustfinger's demise. So if I was reading the actual book of Inkheart, I think that this death would really impact me, just because of why he died. It is an interesting perspective to see what Maggie thinks, as far as the difference between this person who is flesh and blood, who she's actually interacted with, not positively in a lot of ways, that she still has this really visceral reaction to finding out that if he goes back to his book, he is going to die. And finding out from there too how often her dad Mo has tried to have a conversation with Dustfinger about the fact that he might not want to go back to his story, and Dustfinger just never wanted to know. He didn't want to know what happened. He just wanted to go back to his home and live his life, not realizing that he wouldn't have a life when he went back. And after Dustfinger does find that out, he has a moment of just sorrow, and I can't go back, and I think how the book worded it was, I can't go forward but worse, I can't go back. And what a horrible way to like live, feeling kind of stuck where you're at, but having that thought of it's worse that I can't go back. I can't I can't go back to the place that I want to live.
Right. I'm really glad that we are diving into Dustfinger's character. And I think that scene of him being confronted with so many truths that he didn't want to know ends up making this the most fascinating scene between him, Maggie, Mo, his author. And he ends up becoming kind of the most complex, fascinating character, in my opinion, because I think we unintentionally can relate to him the most at this point, as far as having consent be recognized or be violated, and how we can grasp that. For instance, the fact that Mo violates his consent. They have an agreement. I won't have you meet your author. He's then forced to meet his author. Then we have this realization that he's going to die. And yes, Maggie and Mo know this, the author know this, but they don't need to tell Dustfinger that that's his fate. And yet here we are. And the fact that he knows that it's one of Capricorn's men waiting for him to return to the story simply to kill him so violently, and also knowing that his Martin, if he goes back, what does that mean for Gwen? Gwen's going to go back too. And they don't really discuss that part, but obviously Gwen's going to go back with him. At least that's the hope. And so now he's also forcing, this pet that he loves so dearly, potentially to, a fate that is also quite violent, because I'm sure they wouldn't stop with him either. And it reminded me, especially when he ended up being forced to meet his author, that we see this in real life as well. If we wanted to compare it to, say, the story of an adopted child, they are allowed the choice to refuse to meet their birth parents. That is something that birth parents have to accept when they give up, their child. And that is something that I think was violated for Dustfinger, that he was forced to meet his, quote unquote parent. And that ends up leading to a lot of emotional and mental hurt. He runs off. Fareed ends up joining him, who is kind of an adoptive child of his own. He's his guardian. Fareed has entered a world that he does not understand. He's terrified, and he has latched on to Dustfinger to be his mentor. And we also see him saying some hurtful things to Fareed, saying, if I wanted a dog, I would have a dog. I, don't really need you. I don't want to care for you. And I actually want to talk about Fareed for a second, because as we said before, he's our second and only other child character. He's a bit of a teen, I think. So we've got Fareed and Maggie. And you know what's interesting? They're the two characters who have said, what if we just leave everything as it is? Like, what if we just walk away? We have such potential for a future that we can forge on our own. Why are we mixed up in this mess? It's the adults who are constantly coming back into, the foray of Capricorn, his world. And Maggie is asking her father, can we just stop? We don't need to fight to get my mother back, which is quite fascinating too, because obviously that's the biggest reason for why Mo keeps trying to, get back to this book, potentially figure out a way to bring, his wife, Maggie's mother, back. And Maggie, who doesn't know her, is thinking it's not worth it, which I find really fascinating for like a middle grade book that's kind of dark and really thought provoking. And Fareed's kind of the same way in a different form, where, he's asking Dustfinger, what if we just go off and, make our own lives? This is a better world. We have more opportunities. And Dustfinger refuses and wants to return as well. So the parents, or the adults in the situation, are clinging to a past that is, possibly not even within their grasp anymore. And it's the kids saying, let's be rational. Let's stop dealing with this evil figure. No one actually is saying, let's stop Capricorn. Did you notice that typically I feel like in this type of story, an adventure story, a fantasy story, this evil villain is typically the goal by the end is to, stop them, defeat evil. None of these characters have that in their mind. Not one of them had said, you know what, let's actually fight against Capricorn. None of them think that, and none of them think it's possible. And I feel like that's really different from what we would typically see in other books.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that, but that is true. Like in most adventure stories, it is like and this technically still is like us versus them type of a scenario, but it is different in that we're not trying to foil Capricorn's plans. We just want to send him back. Like, we don't want to stop necessarily what he's doing. And I honestly don't know if Mo, if as soon as he gets his wife back, I don't know that he would care. Like, he would probably walk away as well and be like, well, Capricorn can do what he wants to do, but I'm out at this point. Yeah. So that is interesting to think that we're not fighting evil. We're just combating the changes to the status quo, I guess, is kind of what we're fighting. I was really intrigued to go back to your earlier comment about Maggie and her wanting to just stop. And I can't remember if this happened at the same time or if it was a different time within the pages for today, but Maggie and Mo have a conversation about missing their mother or missing her mother. And Mo asks her, "Don't you miss her?" And she says, "Well, I mean, only when I'm mad at you." Like, he has kind of become her completeness, I guess, her home. She even discusses how when she was younger, she took solace in the fact that she was very similar to fairy tale kids, because so many fairy tales are written without mothers, a mother who has died, or a horrible stepmother who you would probably prefer not be on page. And so she kind of just accepted that this is normal. It's normal not to have a mom, and she moved on. And she was 3. I mean, that's really young to have core memories for someone, and so I think that there's that as well, but I thought that was a very sad but sweet moment for Mo to realize that he is his daughter's life. Like, he is so pivotal to her, and I know that he has been so focused on getting his wife back, and I'm sure that it's because he loved his wife and he wants to be with her. But I think that was a really important moment for him as well, to realize that he is important to her. So, because I think at that point he would have sacrificed himself. He would have sent himself into the book to get the mother back. And that's definitely not what Maggie would want.
Right. Honestly, the parent-child dynamic does remain quite strong. Even as there are so many other things going on. The characters are, placed in a jail cell. Now they're running off. And then we're introduced to other characters. And there's all these things happening. But I suppose, like, at its heart, we are kind of intrigued by Mo learning from his daughter just as much as the daughter is learning from him. And I think that's what makes it really interesting, that this is just it's a middle grade book full of adults. And I still have my mind blown by that, because we're seeing the adults learning all the time, not just Mo, and even Dustfinger is trying to work through things as a fictional character within the real world. But we then have Eleanor, who, we still love. She's still great, but she's also gone through the ringer. There is a moment, I think, where Dustfinger ends up reflecting on Eleanor's choices, because she, goes her separate way, wants to return to her books, return to her home, her safe haven. When she does, she discovers that Capricorn's men have burned all of her books. So her life's work, everything that makes her home what it is and makes her who she is, reminds her of her own family. It reminds her of her own father. They discuss that as well. And she's extremely distraught. And so then that's what kind of brings her back into the story, rejoining Mo and Maggie and the rest. And when Dustfinger discovers this, he thinks, well, what did she think? That she would just be able to return to her home untouched now that she's met Capricorn? Of course, her life isn't going to be the same. And he also begins to kind of see how the two of them almost are related in a way, where both of them are never going to feel at home again, or at least there's a loss. They both have lost their sense of home and safety in two different ways, but still, related. So that was really interesting. But even as Eleanor was, returning to her home, kind of getting excited about it, I think there was a moment where we're in her head and she's baffled by her missing people, like her missing her companions that she was just on a road trip with. And it was a very new experience for her. So again, this is middle grade. We do have children characters, but the, adult characters aren't two-dimensional. They're very fleshed out, and they're also learning along with all of us and having some character development, which is fascinating.
Yeah. I really liked the moment where she walked into her house and it was silent. And she has that thought of, I thought it would be an immediate happiness. She didn't explain it as happiness, but she did say, like, I thought it would be an immediate switch that would flick and I would be like, "Ah, this is what I wanted." And she's like, "But I can't help but kind of missing the people I was just with and the adventure that I was just on." And that was a very intriguing moment with her because of how reluctant she's been up to that point. And now she's gone through the ringer and she is wanting to go back to a certain extent. Which obviously, after she finds the rooster, the red rooster hanging from her library ceiling, and then she goes outside and finds all her books burned. And I mean, that was just a really heartbreaking moment because we know that she's someone who lives for her books. And yeah, to have all of that ripped away and all those memories that were tied to it is just heartbreaking.
It really is. And you know what I'm actually going to do for a second? I'm going to backtrack to our first conversation because I just remembered something that we never got to discuss. And I think it's a good segue because I want to discuss these characters as well. But as we were, realizing that Dustfinger is going to die in his story, there is a mention that Fenolio was saying, well, some people have to die. However, characters that I refuse to kill were, I think it was Capricorn and Basta, because they're so brilliantly horrible and terrible. And he thinks, as the author, what if I want to use them again? What if the story continues and I
Yeah.
make a sequel? I want these evil beings to remain, the villains of my story. And that's really interesting because even back to our bookish bite, we were talking about main characters, but we never discussed villains or the bad guys being killed. Obviously, in our brains, we were thinking the people we root for, the people that we
Right.
love. And so, as a reader, kind of thinking about the mind of an author and their choice not to allow, the baddies to die, that's kind of interesting that it seems as though there's a higher chance that they would be willing to kill off their main character that they absolutely love. And then that leads to the question of, can Capricorn and Basta even be defeated in the way that we need them to be? Because if the author doesn't see a way to kill them or didn't create a way to kill them, can they? And then on top of that, we also have learned some information about Basta and Capricorn. It's been interesting to have the author here because he obviously knows the ins and outs of the story,
Yeah.
and he uses that knowledge to actually terrify them. Isn't that kind of, he is playing God a little bit, saying, I
Mhm.
created you. I know your past that you might not want other characters or other people to know about. And uses it as a bit of a bargaining chip at times.
Yeah, his interactions with Basta originally and explaining, because Basta originally thinks that it's not possible for him to meet his author because all books were written before time began, essentially. Like all authors are dead, which I just think is a really funny sentiment anyway.
Mhm.
But so we learned that about Basta. And so Fenolio was like, okay, well, I'll just tell you who you are. And he starts describing the things that are obviously written in the book. And Boss is like, yeah, that just proves that you've read Inkheart. Like that doesn't actually prove anything. And he starts getting deeper into the reasons Basta has the beliefs that he has and why he interacts with people certain ways. And Basta does not like, having someone peek under the curtain and reveal some of those things. And so it leads to a lot of discomfort and anger. And then, of course, he considers killing Fenolio. And I really appreciated Maggie stepping in that moment. One of the discussions that we've had off camera recently is I have been disappointed in some of the middle grade that I've been reading because they are very convenient in their problem solving. And I get some of it. I get to a certain extent. We don't want to make things really, really complicated in a middle grade book because we want our readers to be able to follow along with what's happening. But I think this is a really good moment of figuring out Maggie having to use critical thinking skills to figure out what can I say that would make Boston not kill or harm Fenolio. And she throws out that if you do, you're going to kill Capricorn because she realizes that because of what Fenolio has said, Basta lives for Capricorn. He doesn't really care about anything else. He wants to do whatever Capricorn wants to do and protect Capricorn. And so she manipulates him essentially into not killing the author. And I really liked that scene. And then, of course, seeing Fenolio as they've been captured, they're in like the cattle barn, I think is what they called it, the cattle house or something that they stuffed them in. He's racking his brain on, what can I do? How can I defeat these characters? And Maggie still is trying to come up with, what can I do? How can I help? Which, yeah, I've enjoyed that character. I've enjoyed the author's character a lot because I think he does add some more information without it being info dumpy and still being, I don't know, really, it allows for some complexity of our characters that we wouldn't have gathered without reading Inkheart ourselves. And some of it we couldn't have gained even if we did have that book.
I agree. And now that I'm thinking about it, I think that there's just so much going on with it being a biblio story on so many levels, because not only are we having this author, interact with these characters, Maggie is, being challenged to not just be an avid reader and lover of stories, but be active in the story and try to put two and two together. Like you said, critical thinking. And she is a 12-year-old. We have to keep that in mind. But it seems as though the adults who interact with her, while they still recognize her as a child, they're not treating her like she's a 25-year-old. They also find her capable, which is quite nice. I think there's a good balance where, yes, the goal is to keep her protected, knowing that she's likely the most vulnerable person, among their group, but they also don't see her as being useless and, dead weight where she can't solve, whatever questions may come their way. So that's quite lovely. But what I want to talk about regarding it being, this like biblio story is that so many characters are illiterate or struggle with literacy. And that's something that we may want to take a moment to discuss, because Dustfinger is probably the most literate among those who aren't Capricorn, for instance, because that is something that Capricorn requires of those who work for him. He does not allow them to know how to read and write. And obviously, that is a power dynamic that makes him very powerful and them very dependent on him, telling him like whatever they may need to know. They're not allowed to, for instance, drive even. There's the mention of that where they cannot drive unless they know how to write, because there's also the written test and everything else that goes with it. So that's quite interesting, especially when we're considering, power through information, through education, and the critical thinking. Literacy helps with that. And if these characters don't have that ability, then obviously they're at a disadvantage and are very dependent on Capricorn. So I find that all very interesting. And what I also want to discuss is not only was the author introduced to this narrative, but the character who taught Dustfinger how to write. We end up meeting Risa in the last few chapters of this section. She seems to be a mute character to our understanding. And she has this bond with Dustfinger. He cares for her as well. There seems to be this suggestion where if she betrayed him, he would be quite upset about it. And she reminds him a bit of Maggie. There was a mention, I think, of Farid said this potentially, that she kind of looks like Maggie. And he says, no, she doesn't. It's just that they've got the same color eyes. But there have been some suggestions of who is this Risa and why is she one of Capricorn's like favorite servants as well.
Yeah, I find her character very mysterious because there was definitely a suggestion that she could potentially be Maggie's mother. So, and it would make sense for if she ends up being Maggie's mother, or maybe a character who was swapped with Maggie's mother. That could be a potential, and that's where some of the facial semblant or like resemblance, whatever that word is, comes into play. But I think that it would be interesting if if it does happen to be Maggie's mom, if her being mute has something to do with that. I don't know. Why did you seemed like something just clicked for you. What clicked for you?
Something did just click with me. Okay, so buckle up because I have a crazy theory. And this was something I wanted to mention. It wasn't the theory, but it was information that I wanted to mention in our last episode, but we just ran out of time and there wasn't really a good way to discuss it. But I wanted to discuss how funny it was that we had 3 characters jump from the book of Inkheart into our real world, right? We had Dustfinger, we had Capricorn, and then we had Basta. And the idea is that 3 characters come out, 3 characters must come in, or 3 beings, living beings must go in. And I always thought it was quite funny that they said, yes, okay, so Maggie's mother went in, and so did the 2 cats on her lap. And it's like, okay, that doesn't seem like a very equal exchange, but fine, we'll accept it. And so I wanted to kind of mention that comparison, but we didn't have time to do it. And now that I'm thinking about it, we have been introduced to 2 cats in this section and now
Oh.
Raisa. So was there some way in which the 2 cats and Raisa, aka potentially Maggie's mother, were brought back and Mo just doesn't know because he hasn't seen any of this? He didn't meet the 2 cats. You know who met the cats? Maggie met one of them, and then I think Dustfinger met the other, and now Dustfinger knows Raisa. So, and Maggie wouldn't recognize Raisa even if she did meet her, but Mo hasn't seen these 3, living characters. And so what do you think? Does it seem like we might have something? I don't know how these 3
Yeah.
characters were brought back into the real world, but I did think it was interesting that cats started showing up everywhere. I mean, I'm always game for a cat, but I was like, okay, this is weird. And yeah, so there's something there.
It would make sense for them to have been brought back because we do have the Darius character who has been reading characters into the world for Capricorn. And that means also that, let's say Maggie's mom did end up getting sucked into the book that one night. She could have lived in the story for a little bit and then been pulled back out. I don't know. But then there's the connection between her and Dustfinger because Dustfinger would have been here while she was there if that did happen. But yeah, I think that there's something going on with that because I didn't even think about the fact that we do have 2 cats now that have been mentioned.
Yeah, and why would Raisa know how to read and write? Like, where did
Yeah,
she come from? And there was some mention because she could have come from a nearby village. It's not all characters who are in this compound.
right.
However, I believe he mentioned the idea of, oh, she was one of the characters who was, somewhat whole, but there might have been a suggestion, a line that said that it's Darius's fault that she can't speak,
Mm,
because not all characters come out whole when Darius was reading aloud.
yeah.
So that's why I'm like, maybe, maybe not. But there are so many characters moving about that it would explain that this would take a long time to kind of put 2 and 2 together because Mo hasn't even seen any of these characters. But then the question is, does Capricorn know who Raisa is? And is that potentially why she's one of his favorite servants? And she tried to escape twice, but she never got very far. So there's a reason why Capricorn really wants to kind of keep her under lock and key. I don't know. Food
Yeah.
for thought. We could put a pin in it and see what happens in this final third of the book.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so let's put a pin in that then, and we can check back next week to see if the theory is correct. I have a feeling that it is. I have good vibes with that. I think that it might be what actually ends up happening. So we do need to wrap up this episode with our 3 questions. So, and you get to answer first this week. So our first question is, what rating are we feeling for this section of the book? Who is our favorite character that has either been introduced or throughout the story? And then what questions do you still have?
All right. So I'm going to answer the second question first, just to keep everybody on their toes.
Sadness.
Ha 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 ha. Speaking of favorite characters, this may be not fully accurate, but I'll say that the character that I find the most interesting at the moment and that I've grown the most invested in is Dustfinger. I think that he's, dark for understandable reasons, and the world's been really horrible to him. And my heart just kind of breaks for this character who, has been burned physically, literally, and also emotionally. So I think he's hard to find the ability to trust others, and that's why those don't trust him. It's just a terrible cycle, and almost this doomed character that you kind of want to happily ever after for in some way. So I think that he's my favorite character, mainly because I can't stop thinking about him. I think he's the one that I have the most questions about, and I'm the most invested to see what he does, because he's a bit unpredictable as well, which I enjoy. For a question that I have moving forward, I suppose, yeah, is my theory correct? Is Raisa her mother, and those two cats that have popped up, the cats that were somehow sucked into that world? And I think that we also have kind of discovered that they probably aren't going to go into the world of Inkheart, at least not for this narrative. So we've also answered that one. So the new one is our theory correct? Did we actually meet Maggie's mother? Who knows? When it comes to my rating, at the moment, I still feel pretty comfortable at 4 stars. I could maybe be at 3.75. It just depends, because I'm finding the action at this point a little bit repetitive. Obviously, this is a chunky narrative and there's a lot happening, but we've got the characters, making their way to Capricorn, running away from Capricorn, making their way again to Capricorn. And I feel as though where we stopped at this point is exactly kind of where we stopped at the first third of the book, as if nothing's really changed. With that said, we have gained a significant amount of information and far more investment in the character development of our cast of characters. So that's why I'm still probably just settling at a 4-star for the moment, but I'm allowing to acknowledge that my interest has waned a little bit compared to last time. But what about you, Danny? How are you feeling, and how would you answer these questions?
I'm essentially just going to ditto your facts about the rating, because I'm in between a 3.75 and a 4-star. I really do. There are so many little intricate things that I am enjoying about the storyline, but I do feel a little bit of fatigue as I'm reading, because of how chunky the book is. And I like a chunky book, but we have this roundabout. I feel like we're kind of, the snake chasing its tail or whatever. Like we're just repeating the same things. And so, I mean, the end is going to be the deciding factor, as it always is. But I think that if we do some different things with the ending and have our characters explore some different ways of communicating, different ways of problem solving, and things like that, I think that it'll stay at a 4. But we'll see. We'll see what happens. So I'll settle with a 4, with the same thought process that my interest has waned just a little bit. The which question do I want to answer next? Instead of doing a favorite character, I think I'm going to do a favorite relationship that we've seen on page. And we didn't get to actually talk about this at all, but I really like the fact that Gwen is obsessed with Farid. I think that it's so cute. Anytime Gwen pops up, Dustfinger's like, "Oh, where have you been?" And then he immediately goes over and is like chirruping and pouncing all over Farid, and then he'll go off without even acknowledging Dustfinger. I don't know. I have found that those pages make me smile. So that's probably the relationship that I'm happy has formed for both of them. And then as far as questions go, I guess my main question is just I hope, I'm assuming it's not going to happen. I hope that we get a glimpse into the book life, whether or not that is with Maggie's mom, getting to have a conversation with her about her life. Like even if that was like an epilogue or something, I want someone to tell me, how was it like for a real life person to live in the story of Inkheart? Because we've had all these mentions of fantastical creatures, giants, trolls, goblins, Tinkerbell. Like we've had all these mentions, but we don't actually get to see that on page. I do think that that lends a little bit for this being more magical realism than it is fantasy, because of a lot of those fantasy elements not being super present on page. So that would probably be my question: is are we going to really dive in this last third to the fantasy elements now that we have all the characters established? Can we dig into the nitty gritty and see some more magic? Because I would like that. So with that, we have our episode coming to a close. We really hope that you guys will join us next week for our final discussion of Inkheart. We will be reading chapter 38 through the end of the book. So if you would like to join us, please make sure that you read those pages. And if you are interested in what book we will be reading in the month of June, remember to check the description down below. Thank you guys so much for being here with us. Happy reading.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Not Reading for Content. Be sure to check the description for a schedule of our upcoming reads for this season. And for reminders and other updates, you can follow the podcast on Instagram at Not Reading for Content. Where else can listeners find you, Danny?
I have a booktube and an Instagram. Both can be found at danny.dabbles. What about you?
I have the same platforms. My booktube is at Leandra the TBR0, and my Instagram is at Leandra _ the TBR0. Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to tune in next Friday for our next episode.